The girth strap was cut clean on one side. The other side torn by hand, to make it look like age had done the work. The horse kept running. The man didn't. 3 months later, 11 miles out, a widow sat counting money folded into a handkerchief. $11. She counted it every night, like the number might multiply, if she was patient enough. It didn't multiply. Only debt did that. Outside her window, the wagons rolled past in the early gray. 4, 5, 6. Not one of them slowed down for her anymore. Then someone knocked. A man with his hat already off. His voice already soft, before the first word left him. He sat where the light was kindest to his face, and she noticed that, without knowing yet why she'd need to. Out past the ridge there was a ranch. A man who walked wrong. And a ledger that had never once added up. She put her hand on the door. The morning the 6 weeks ended, Odile Marsh stood at her window and counted the wagon wheels going by. 4, 5, 6 wagons before breakfast. Not one of them slowed down for her anymore. That was how you knew. Not from a calendar. From the wagons. She'd learned that lesson from every widow before her. Amber Creek was kind for exactly as long as kindness cost nothing. Casseroles came the first week. Prayers came the second. By the third week the church women stopped meeting her eyes at market. By the 6th they stopped coming by at all. And the landlady, a soft-spoken woman named Prudence Kell, sat across from her at the kitchen table, with her hands folded, and said the thing Odile had been waiting to hear since the funeral. "I can't hold the room past Friday, dear. I'm sorry. I truly am." She wasn't lying about the sorry part. That almost made it worse. Odile was 31 years old. She had buried a husband, and she owned, in total, 2 traveling bags, 1 black dress gone the color of old coal, and $11 folded into a handkerchief she counted every night like it might multiply, if she was patient enough. It didn't multiply. Money never did that. Only debt did that. So when Roland Hollis knocked on Prudence Kell's door on a Tuesday afternoon, with his hat already off, and his voice already soft, Odile let him in. Because that's what you did. You let the door open. You didn't have the luxury of asking who was on the other side. He sat where the light was kindest to his face. She noticed that. Filed it away, without knowing yet that she'd need it. "There's a man out past the ridge," Roland said. "A cousin of mine. Runs cattle. Good land, solid house. He's got trouble keeping the place in order since his accident." "Accident," Odile repeated. "A fall. Left leg's never come back right. He needs someone steady in that house. Someone who can manage things, while he manages the rest. And he needs a wife for that." Roland smiled like she'd said something clever instead of something obvious. "He needs a household run properly, Mrs. Marsh. Call it whatever suits you." She didn't call it anything. She just sat there, and did the math she'd been doing every night, with the handkerchief. $11. 2 bags. A room she'd lose by Friday. There wasn't a choice buried in that math. There was only a door, and whether or not she walked through it. She walked through it. The wedding happened on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays, apparently, were when the county clerk had time. The office smelled like dust, and old paper, and something faintly like machine oil. The clerk, a narrow man named Whitfield, with ink permanently pressed into the creases of his fingers, read the vows off a printed card the way a man reads a grocery list. Flat. Efficient. Done in under 2 minutes. There were no flowers. Nobody expected there to be. Odile wore the black dress. It had faded toward gray, from too many washings. She tried to press the sleeve crease out that morning with a flat iron heated on the stove, and burned a small welt into her wrist doing it. She kept touching that welt with her thumb through the whole ceremony. It gave her something to do besides think. Because if she really thought, about what she was doing, standing in a room that smelled like dust, marrying a man she had met exactly once. No. Don't. Don't think about it. Sign the paper. That's all this is. A paper. Caleb Hollis stood across the narrow desk from her. She'd met him 2 weeks before, when Roland brought him by the boarding house for what amounted to an inspection, though nobody called it that out loud. He'd stood near the door, that day with his weight tipped onto his right leg, and his hand wrapped around the top of a dark cane, and he hadn't smiled once. Hadn't tried small talk. Hadn't done any of the things men usually did, when they were sizing up a woman they might marry. He just watched. Careful. Quiet. Like a man cataloging a room he expected to leave in a hurry. At the door, on his way out, he turned back. Looked at her directly for the first time. I don't need much, he'd said. A woman who can run a house, and leave a man be. That's all. I don't need much either, she'd answered. Same flat tone. Same nothing behind it. That had been the whole of their courtship, if you could call 2 sentences a courtship. Which you couldn't. Which was fine. She hadn't come here looking for a courtship. Now, in Whitfield's office, Caleb signed the paper after her. His handwriting was heavy. Deliberate. The hand of a man who'd learned to write late in life, and never quite trusted the pen. That's all, Whitfield said, stamping the page. That's all. 2 words to end one life, and start another. Outside, the sky couldn't decide between rain and gray nothing, and settled for both at once. A buggy waited at the road's edge. 1 horse. Brown, patient, already hitched. Roland stood beside it in a coat that had clearly cost more than everything Odile owned combined, wearing an expression that wanted to be warmth, and mostly managed it. Well, he said, looking between them. That's done, then? Either of them answered. You've got a good thing here, Roland went on, settling his attention on Odile like a man explaining arithmetic to a child. Caleb's a decent man. The ranch has everything a body needs. I appreciate the concern, Odile said. The way you say something, when you mean the opposite. Roland's smile widened. It reached his eyes in a way that made the hair on her arms lift, though she couldn't have said exactly why. That's all I've ever had for this family, he said. Concern. Caleb was already at the side of the buggy, working himself up into the seat. It cost him. She could see that plainly, the bad leg dragging, the arms doing double duty, the brief tightening of his jaw at the top of the climb, where the pain apparently lived. He didn't ask for help. Didn't look at Roland while he did it. Didn't look at her either. Odile climbed up on her own side without comment. Take care of each other, Roland called, patting the buggy rail like a man sending off a horse he owned. Caleb clicked his tongue. The horse leaned into the harness. And that was the whole wedding. 2 minutes with a clerk. 2 sentences with a stranger. 1 brown horse pulling them both toward a life either of them had chosen. The Hollis Ranch sat 11 miles past Amber Creek, out where the road stopped pretending to be a road, and became 2-wheel ruts through scrubbed grass. Odile watched the town shrink behind them, and told herself she wasn't grieving it. She'd only lived there 7 months. Long enough to bury a husband. Not long enough to call it home. Because home, she was starting to understand, wasn't a place. It was a feeling you either had, or you didn't, and she hadn't had it in a long time. The silence in the buggy wasn't hostile. It was the silence of 2 people carrying something too large to discuss yet, both still finding their grip on the weight of it. After 20 minutes, she broke it. Is there anything I should know, going in? Caleb thought about that longer than the question seemed to require. Kitchen stocked, not organized. 2 hands work the place, Amos and Jesse. They don't come in the house. They know their work. Repairs? Anything need attention? Roof on the west side. I haven't gotten to it. I know roofing, she said. My father built houses. He glanced sideways at her. Filed that away, the same way she'd filed away Roland's smile. Neither of them said anything about the filing. Another mile passed before he spoke again. You'll have your own room. End of the hall. I moved my things out last week. Thank you? There's a bolt on the inside of the door. She looked at him then. Really looked. He kept his eyes on the road. I mention it, he said, because I want you to know it's there. Not because I think you'll need it. Just, I want you to know. It was the most human thing he'd said to her yet. More human than the vows. More human than the 2 sentences at the boarding house door. She held on to it the way she'd held onto the $11, carefully, like it might be all she got. I know this isn't what either of us chose, he said. Neither is losing a husband to a mine. That shouldn't have collapsed, she thought, but didn't say. Instead she said the only thing that felt true. Neither am I. He nodded once. That seemed to settle something between them, though either could have said what. The ranch came into view around a bend, and Odile got her first real look at what her life had just become. Bigger than she'd expected. A 2-story house of timber and stone, a porch sagging on the left, where a support post had rotted through at the base. Behind it, a barn in better shape than the house. Someone had clearly prioritized the animals over their own comfort, and beyond that, fenced pasture running out toward low hills. Horses. She counted 6. A scattering of cattle further off. Chickens working the yard in their busy, aimless way. It was a working place. Every inch of it built for function, none of it built for anyone's comfort, but the animals. She understood that kind of house. She'd grown up in one just like it. Caleb unhitched the horse, with the economy of a man who'd rebuilt every motion in his life around a body that no longer cooperated. She watched without watching, the tilt he used to spare the bad leg, the extra work his arms took on, the careful rationing of effort. It wasn't self-pity. That was the first thing she noticed standing in that yard. Whatever this man had lost, he hadn't organized his life around mourning it out loud. That was something. She didn't know yet how much. Her room, true to his word, sat at the end of the upstairs hall. Cleared out. Clean patches on the walls, where pictures used to hang. A bed, a washstand, a small dresser, a window overlooking the back pasture. She sat on the edge of the bed, with her 2 bags at her feet, and listened to the house settle around her. Below, she heard Caleb's uneven rhythm moving through the rooms, the drag of the left foot, the firmer step of the right, the hollow tap of the cane between them. Kitchen. Office. Hall. Front door. Porch. A circuit she'd come to memorize over the following weeks, though she didn't know that yet either. She didn't go down that first night. She lay on top of the wool blanket, with her boots still on, and made herself think about practical things instead of the enormous thing she'd just done. Water source. Pantry inventory. The sagging porch post. The state of the henhouse. Practical things had beginnings and middles and ends. If you did them right, they produced something you could measure. Feelings didn't work that way. Feelings just sat in your chest like a stone, and refused to be measured at all. She closed her eyes. Slept harder than she expected to. The first week found its shape the way water finds a low place. Not by force. Just by settling. She was up before Caleb every morning, which surprised him, she could tell, though he never said so. She'd been rising at 5 since childhood. Old habits had roots deeper than new circumstances could dig out. By the time she heard his door, coffee was already on, and the first morning she set a cup at his place, without comment, and went back to the stove. He drank it. Said nothing. Second morning, same. By the third, it was simply a fact of the household. Like the sun. Nobody thanked the sun for coming up. She cooked plainly, and without fuss, eggs, salt pork, bread when the flour held, because she wasn't trying to impress a man who hadn't asked to be impressed. The kitchen surrendered its logic to her quickly enough. Where things lived. What was low? What had been neglected past saving? There was a crock in the back of the pantry gone unrecognizable, with age, and she disposed of it without ceremony. There was a skillet that hadn't been properly cured in years, and she fixed that on the second day, while Caleb was out with the stock. He noticed. She could tell by the small pause he made at the smell of hot oil, when he came in for the midday meal. He didn't say anything about it. She hadn't done it for the saying. Amos was about what she expected. 50-some years old, a face like weathered fence board, the kind of quiet that came from decades of outdoor work, with no particular need for conversation. He tipped his hat the first day, said Ma'am, and that covered most of what passed between them for a week. Jessie was younger. Early 20s. Reddish hair, the particular energy of a young man who hadn't decided yet what kind of man he was going to be. He found reasons to be near the house when she worked outside. She recognized it as curiosity, not intention, and didn't encourage or discourage either. What she noticed most that first week, watching Caleb work the animals, watching him bend over ledgers at the kitchen table some evenings, with a pencil and a jaw set tight, was that he pushed. Not recovered. Not triumphed. Just pushed. Daily. Without any guarantee it would add up to anything. She'd seen men handle loss two ways in her life. Fold inward and let it become the whole of them. Or push back. Caleb pushed back. She caught him one evening bent over a column of figures, pencil scratching small circles and question marks into the margins, and something about the intensity of it snagged her attention. She didn't ask? Not yet. She was still mapping the territory. But she filed it away, the way she'd filed away the bolt on her door, the way she'd filed away Roland's smile. Everything went into the file. She didn't know yet which pieces would matter. So she kept all of them. It was near the end of the first week that she found the deed. She hadn't gone looking for it. She'd been organizing the small parlor shelf, a task that had started, as dusting and turned, the way her tasks often did, into a full accounting of every object in the room, when a folder slid loose from behind a row of almanacs. Old. The leather corner gone soft with handling. Inside sat the original land grant. Yellowed. Careful copperplate handwriting she didn't recognize, dated more than 2 decades back. She wasn't trying to pry. She told herself that twice while she read it, which was usually a sign she was, in fact, prying. The language was formal, dense, the kind that took 2 reads to untangle. But one clause stood out from the rest, because someone, Caleb's father, she guessed, from the ink's age, had underlined it in a hand gone shaky with time. Said grant to remain in the direct bloodline of the grantee, and shall not be sold, mortgaged, or transferred to any party outside that bloodline for a term of 30 years, from this date, except by joint written consent of all living direct heirs. She read it 3 times. Direct bloodline. Roland wasn't Caleb's father's son. Roland was a cousin. Which meant if Caleb ever lost the capacity to run this place, if something happened to him, Roland couldn't simply inherit it. Couldn't simply be handed the reins the way she'd assumed, back at Prudence Kell's kitchen table, that this whole arrangement worked. Unless there was another way in. A way around the bloodline. A way that didn't need Caleb dead. Just needed him unable to object. She put the folder back exactly as she'd found it, spine facing the same direction, dust disturbed in the same pattern. Her hands were steadier doing that than she expected them to be, given what her chest was doing underneath. She didn't tell Caleb that night. Told herself it was, because she needed to understand it better first. That was true. It was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that she'd learned, a long time ago, that information was safer held than spent. You didn't hand a man a wound before you knew what he'd do with the knowing of it. So she waited. And she watched. And that night, for the first time since the wedding, she took a small notebook from the bottom of her traveling bag, one she'd carried since Elias died, mostly empty, meant for grocery lists, that never got written, and she wrote down the date. And under it 3 words. Bloodline. 30 years. Roland. Then she closed the notebook, and put it back at the bottom of the bag, under the folded black dress she hoped never to wear again for the reason she'd worn it the first time. The second week she started on his leg. She hadn't been asked? He hadn't asked for anything, that was becoming clear, as its own kind of habit. Asking cost him something she couldn't name yet, but she'd grown up watching her mother do this kind of work, learned from a woman 2 counties over who'd learned it, from someone before her, a whole chain of unglamorous, practical knowledge about what a body could relearn, if you were patient enough with it. She brought it up one evening in the kitchen, him bent over the ledger, her drying the last plate. "I've worked with injuries like yours before," she said, without ceremony, because ceremony would have made it a bigger thing than it needed to be. "I can't promise anything. But there are things worth trying, if you're willing." He looked up. "What kind of things?" "Movement work. Pressure. Rotation on the damaged tissue. It's not comfortable. But I've seen it help." A long pause. "Doctor in Amber Creek told me the nerve's gone for good." "I'm not promising nerves," she said. "I'm saying there's muscle and joint that can be reclaimed even when the nerve's not right. It won't be what it was. It can be better than it is now." He studied her for what felt like a long time. "How often?" he said finally. "Every other evening. 20 minutes to start." "All right. Okay." That was the whole negotiation. 2 syllables each, and something had shifted underneath them that neither one named. The work itself was strange, in the particular way medical work is strange. Nothing to do with wanting. Everything to do with the specific vulnerability of a body that no longer obeyed its owner. She worked on the kitchen floor, with him seated, his bad leg extended, and she learned the geography of the injury slowly, the way you learn any unfamiliar ground. He was a difficult patient in the way difficult patients usually were. Not uncooperative. Braced. He'd spent 2 years learning to hold against pain, which meant he'd also learned to hold against the release of it, and the first 3 sessions were mostly a negotiation between her hands and a muscle that had decided, a long time ago, never to trust anyone again. "You're holding," she said, second session, not looking up. "I know I'm holding. You have to stop." Easy to say. I know it's not easy. But if the muscle doesn't release, we don't get anywhere near the real problem. Silence. "Think about somewhere else," she said. "Not the leg." "Where?" "Anywhere. Somewhere you know well." A pause longer than the question deserved. "East pasture," he said finally. "In spring. After rain, the grass comes in, with yellow in it. Like it's lit from the inside somehow." His voice had changed. Just slightly. Something in it had let go, before the muscle did. She felt it shift under her hand. "Good," she said. "Keep that." He didn't say anything else. But he held the east pasture in his mind for the rest of the session, and when he stood afterward, and put weight on the leg, his face carried an expression that wasn't quite surprise, and wasn't quite anything, with a name. She let herself feel the small, private satisfaction of having done something right. She didn't say anything about that either. "Some things you kept." Roland came on the 8th day. He arrived mid-morning, riding a good bay horse, wearing the same understated expensive coat, and walked into the house, without knocking, a small thing, she noted, but a telling one. The behavior of a man who considered a place an extension of his own property, not someone else's home. Caleb was out checking fence. Odile sat at the kitchen table, with the household ledger, and a tin of loose receipts she'd been trying, unsuccessfully, to make sense of for 2 days. "Mrs. Hollis," Roland said, settling into the chair across from her with the ease of long habit. "Settling in well, I hope." "Well enough." "Good. Good." His eyes did their slow proprietary sweep of the kitchen. "Caleb treating you properly?" "He's treating me fine. He can be difficult." "He's been nothing but plain with me," she said. "Plain suits me." Roland smiled, and it didn't reach his eyes this time, though he clearly meant it to. "Early days," he said. He stayed nearly an hour. Asked about the house. The hands? The account she had open in front of her, that last question, with a particular, carefully casual weight to it, that she recognized instantly, because she'd been trained her whole adult life to recognize exactly, that kind of weight in a man's voice. "Anything interesting in there?" he asked, nodding at the ledger. "Just getting familiar with how things have been organized," she said. "There's a lot of history to go through." "Of course." He wrapped both hands around a coffee cup she hadn't offered him, but he'd poured himself anyway. "You let me know if anything's confusing. Some of the older arrangements are complicated. I'm happy to walk you through the thinking behind them." "I appreciate that," she said, and smiled the exact same size smile back at him. When Caleb came through the back door, the temperature of the room dropped, without anyone raising their voice. The two men spoke a few minutes about supply arrangements. Roland mentioned he'd been in touch with the feed merchant, arranged the usual terms, and Caleb's answers were short. Flat. The kind of short that meant a man who knew better than to argue this particular fight in this particular kitchen. After Roland left, Caleb stood in the doorway a long moment, watching the retreating shape of him on horseback. "He comes often?" Odile asked. "Often enough." A pause. Then, without turning, "Don't let him look at the accounts." She looked up. "Anything specific I should know?" "Not yet," he said, and went on through the house, the drag step tap of his walk fading down the hall. "Not yet." She sat with that phrase a long time after he'd gone. Because it wasn't a no. It wasn't nothing. It was a door left open a crack, and she understood, sitting there with the ledger and the tin of receipts, that she'd just been handed the beginning of something much larger than a household to run. She got the notebook out that night and wrote it all down. Roland's visit. The question about the accounts. Caleb's answer. Not yet. Under it, she wrote one more line, because it had been sitting in her chest since the parlor shelf a week earlier, and she needed somewhere to put it that wasn't her own head. The bloodline clause. Find out what it means if a man can't manage his own affairs. The accounts worried her in a way that went past ordinary struggle. She'd expected a ranch running thin. That was the ordinary arithmetic of too much going out, and not enough coming in, and she'd seen enough of that arithmetic in her own life to recognize it without alarm. This wasn't that. This was the specific, subtle wrongness of numbers arranged not to work. Supply costs logged at rates that didn't match the receipts folded behind them. Payments recorded with no corresponding record of what they'd purchased. References, in older entries, to contracts she could find no actual documents for anywhere in the files, as though someone had gone back through the paper trail, with careful hands, and removed exactly what needed removing, leaving just enough behind to look like ordinary neglect. She went through it twice. Then a third time. Then she sat back, and thought about Roland walking in without knocking. About his voice asking anything interesting in there, with that careful, casual weight. About Caleb saying don't let him look at the accounts like the sentence cost him something to say out loud. She was careful not to leap. She'd learned that carefulness the hard way, watching her own husband leap at a mining venture two other men had already walked away from, watching that leap cost him everything, including, eventually, his life. She wasn't going to leap. She was going to watch. So she kept her own notes, separate from the ledger, dates and figures, and discrepancies, nothing accusatory, just the patient record of someone who had learned that truth, when it existed, tended to leave a pattern behind it whether anyone wanted it to or not. 2 evenings later, working on Caleb's leg, she found the thing that changed the shape of everything. It wasn't in the ledger. It was in the tack room, of all places, where she'd gone looking for a spare cloth to wrap the liniment jar. A saddle hung on the far wall, older than the others, clearly not in regular use, and the leather girth strap beneath it had been cut nearly through. Not frayed from wear. Not worn thin the honest way leather wears thin. Cut. Clean on one side, ragged where the blade had caught, and someone had finished the job, with their hands instead, to make it look accidental. To make it look like age. She stood in that tack room a long moment, with the cloth still in her hand, not breathing right. Because a girth strap failing under a rider's weight didn't just throw a man. It threw him hard. Fast. No warning. The kind of fall that could crush a leg beyond repair, and leave everyone, including the man it happened to, believing it was simply bad luck. An accident. The kind of thing nobody thinks to question, because who questions luck? She carried that cloth back inside, with her hands not quite steady, and she didn't say anything to Caleb that evening. She told herself, again, that she needed more, before she handed him something this heavy. That was true. It was also, again, not the whole truth. The whole truth was that some part of her, the part that had watched Elias climb down into a mine 3 other men had already refused, the part that had buried a husband and counted $11 into a handkerchief every night for 6 weeks, that part of her had gone very quiet and very cold, and was already, without her permission, starting to build a case. She got the notebook that night and wrote it all down. The cut strap. The tack room. The date. Then, underneath, in handwriting steadier than she felt. This was not an accident. Outside her window, the wind moved low across the pasture, and somewhere below her the house creaked the way old wood does when it settles into the dark. And Odile Hollis lay on top of her wool blanket, with her boots still on, staring at a ceiling she couldn't see, and understood clearly, for the first time since the wedding, that she hadn't married into a household that needed managing. She'd married into something somebody was actively trying to steal. And whoever was doing it had never planned on a widow, with a practical mind, and nowhere left to run, showing up in the middle of it, quietly writing everything down. Caleb found her the next evening, still sitting, still pressing her palms flat against a ledger she hadn't opened again. "You've been at that a long time," he said. "I have." He lowered himself into the chair across from her, the cane hooked over the table edge, his bad leg extended the way it did when the ache had settled in for the evening. "You going to tell me," he asked, "or am I going to keep finding you staring at closed books like they've done something to you?" She almost laughed. Almost. The sound got about halfway up her throat and died there. "There's something in the tack room," she said. "I should have told you last night." His face didn't change. That was the thing about Caleb Hollis she'd learned fastest. His face didn't change when the news was bad. It changed when the news was good. Bad news, he just went still, like a man bracing a wall he already suspected was coming down. "Tell me now," he said. So she did. She told him about the saddle and the corner nobody used. About the girth strap, cut clean on one side, ragged on the other, where someone had finished the job by hand to make it look like age. She told him what a strap like that would do to a man's weight mid-ride. No warning. No give. Just gone, all at once, the horse still moving, and the rider not anymore. She watched him understand it in real time. Watched the exact moment the abstract idea, "someone did this to me," stopped being abstract, and became a physical memory his body still carried in the drag of his left foot. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then, which saddle? The one in the back corner. Dust on the seat. Nobody's ridden it in years. "That was my father's saddle," he said. "Nobody rides it, because nobody's supposed to touch it." "Except somebody touched it," she said. 2 years ago. Right before your accident." The word accident came out of her mouth sounding wrong now. She heard it land wrong, the way a word does, when you've stopped believing it applies. Caleb heard it too. She watched something tighten and hold in his jaw. "I need you to say the other part," he said. "The part you're not saying." She met his eyes. "I don't think you fell, Caleb. I think somebody made sure you would." The kitchen went very quiet. Outside, the wind pressed against the window, and for a moment it felt like the whole ranch was exhaling something it had been holding for 2 years right alongside them. "I know," he said finally. "You know? I've thought it. Every day since. Never had anything to hang it on besides thinking it." His hand closed slowly around the head of the cane. "Man doesn't come off a horse he's ridden 100 times, next to a fence post he checked himself the week before, for no reason at all. I told myself for 2 years I was looking for someone to blame, because blaming's easier than accepting bad luck. And now, she said? Now you're telling me it wasn't bad luck. Not the way I'm reading it. He looked at his own hands on the table like they belonged to someone else. Roland, he said. Not a question. I don't have proof of that yet, she said. I have proof someone cut a strap. I don't have proof of who. Caleb's jaw worked once, twice, like he was chewing on something too large to swallow whole. Then get it, he said. Because I've spent 2 years pushing myself back up off a floor somebody else knocked me onto. And if there's a name behind that, I want it in my hand, before I want anything else in this life. She nodded. Something in her chest, tight for days, loosened half an inch. We're not going to move fast, she said. Fast gets us caught before we're ready. Fast gets the proof buried. I know how to be patient, he said. Flat. Not bitter. Just fact. I've had 2 years of practice. The lamp burned low between them, and neither of them moved to put it out for a long while. Amos found her 3 days later, out by the barn, checking the same tack room for the 4th time, hoping the girth's strap might tell her something new just from being looked at harder. It didn't. Cut things don't grow new information just because you stare at them. Mrs. Hollis, Amos said from the doorway. Startled her enough that she nearly dropped the strap. Amos. I didn't hear you. Don't move quiet on purpose, he said. Just move quiet. 40 years doing it. He came in slow, looked at the strap in her hands, looked at the saddle it belonged to, and his weathered face carried something she hadn't seen there before. Recognition. The specific kind that comes with guilt attached. You know something, she said. It wasn't a question either. Everyone on this ranch, it seemed, had stopped asking questions and started stating facts at each other. Amos was quiet a long moment. Long enough that she thought he might just turn and walk back out, the way men his age sometimes did, when a conversation got too close to a door they nailed shut a long time ago. Then he sat down on an overturned feed bucket, slow, like his knees had opinions about the decision, and he looked at the strap in her hand instead of at her face. 2 years, he said. I've carried this 2 years, Mrs. Hollis. And I want you to understand something, before I say the rest. What's that? I got a wife in town. Got a daughter married, with 2 babies of her own. I got a job on this ranch that's the only steady thing I've had in 15 years of unsteady things. He looked up at her finally. A man in my position doesn't go accusing people, with money and standing. Not without it costing him everything he's got left. I understand that, she said, and meant it. She understood it better than he knew. He nodded slow, like her understanding had bought him something. Week before Mr. Hollis's accident, Amos said, I was out mending fence past the North Corral. Saw 2 riders come up from the road. Strangers. Didn't recognize either one. They met Mr. Roland out by the old grain shed. Handed him something. Never saw what. He handed something back. Money, by the shape of the exchange. I've seen enough money change hands in my life to know the shape of it even from a distance. Her heart was doing something complicated in her chest. Did you tell anyone? Told Mr. Hollis's father, Amos said. Before he passed. He was already sick by then. Didn't have the strength left to chase it down, and I didn't have the standing to chase it down, without him behind me. Amos's hands twisted together, rough and worn. Then Mr. Hollis had his accident the next week, and I told myself it was nothing. Told myself that for 2 years, because the alternative was too big a thing to carry alone. You're not carrying it alone anymore, Odile said. Something in the old man's face cracked, just slightly, just at the edges, the way weathered wood finally gives, after years of holding a shape it was never quite built to hold. I should have said something sooner, he said. You're saying it now, she said. That's what matters. He nodded, stood, knees complaining again, and paused at the doorway. Those 2 riders, he said. Never saw them again after that week. But I'd know their horses. Distinctive markings. One had a blaze shaped like a lightning strike, off-center. I'd know that horse anywhere. She wrote that down the second he left. Blaze. Lightning strike. Off-center. It wasn't a name. But it was a shape. And shapes, she was learning, eventually became names, if you were patient enough to keep tracing them. The storage room at the old Kessler place sat 4 miles past the edge of Amber Creek, down a lane more suggestion than road, and Caleb told her about it on a Thursday evening, while she worked the deep tissue behind his knee, the two of them fallen into the particular rhythm their sessions had built over weeks, her hands moving, his voice loosening the way the muscle did, one following the other like they'd learned to trust the same signal. Roland keeps a second set of books there, he said. Told me about it once years back. Before either of us had reason to hide anything from the other. Why would he need a second set? Insurance, he said. His word, not mine. Said a man in business needs somewhere to keep the truth separate from what he shows other people. That's not insurance, Odile said. That's a confession waiting to be found. Caleb almost smiled. The corner of his mouth did the thing it did when something struck him, as true in a way that also hurt. He doesn't think anyone's looking, he said. That's the whole trick of it. Man like Roland doesn't plan for someone patient enough to actually look. He has a key, she said. I have a key too, Caleb said. Gave it to me himself, before the accident, when we still managed some property together. He's forgotten I have it. Or he's assumed I lost it, the way I lost most things that year. You didn't lose it. Kept it in the lining of an old coat, he said. Wasn't sure why. Some part of me knew it might matter someday. Someday's here, she said. They went on a Saturday, because Roland's habits were as predictable as the sunrise. County Commissioners' meeting, first Saturday of every month, breakfast at the hotel beforehand, gone from dawn until well past noon. The ride out was quiet. Not uncomfortable. Just quiet the way two people get quiet, when they both know the day ahead is heavier than the conversation can hold. Caleb drove. His hands steady on the reins, his left leg braced against the footboard less than it used to be. She'd noticed that over the past week, the leg holding more of its own weight, without being asked, and she filed that away too, in the growing ledger of things she was keeping about this man, that had nothing to do with fraud or theft, or missing money. They passed through the edge of Amber Creek just after 7, and there, tied outside the hotel exactly where habit put him, stood Roland's bay horse. Odile looked at it, and didn't let herself feel relief. Relief was for after. Relief now was just carelessness wearing a nicer name. The Kessler place sat back from the road the way abandoned things do, like it had stopped belonging to any particular person, and started belonging to the landscape instead. Main building. Smaller outbuilding. A collapsed section of fence along the south side, that nobody had bothered to fix in years. They pulled up. Sat a moment in the stillness. No other horses. No fresh tracks in the soft dirt. The room he uses is through the back, Caleb said. Second door on the left. They went in, through a side entrance most people wouldn't have known existed, and the air inside smelled like dust and old paper, the same smell as the county clerk's office, where they'd been married, except this dust felt different. Heavier. Like it was hiding something instead of just settling. The storage room had a good padlock on it. Except it was the same type of lock Odile had seen on the ranch's own supply boxes, and Caleb, watching her look at it, produced a second key, without a word. He reuses the same lock type everywhere, Caleb said. Cheaper that way. Always has been cheap, where it costs him nothing to be careful instead. Convenient for us, she said. The lock gave easy. Almost insultingly easy, given everything it was supposed to be protecting. Inside, shelves along 2 walls. Crates stacked in the corner. A filing cabinet for drawers locked. Same key, she asked? He tried it. The top drawer opened. She almost laughed at that too. The absurdity of it, all this careful architecture of theft, protected in the end by a man too cheap to buy a second kind of lock. They worked fast. She took the files, he held the lamp steady despite the ache she knew was building in his leg, from standing this long without moving. The second drawer held what she expected: payment records that didn't appear in any official ledger, correspondence in Roland's careful hand. The third drawer held what she didn't expect. At the back, unlabeled, a folder thicker than the others. Inside, a payment record dated 2 years back, made out to a company she didn't recognize. Below it, a handwritten note in a rougher hand than Roland's, specific details about a fence line, about a rider's habitual route, about timing. And behind that, a letter. Not addressed to anyone by name. Careful. The language of a man who understood exactly how much distance a well-chosen word could put between himself and a consequence. Regarding the structural concern we discussed. Handle it the way we spoke about. No further correspondence needed on this matter. Odile read it twice. Her hands had gone very still, the way hands go still right, before they start shaking, the body deciding which reaction to have, before the mind's caught up. "It's here," she said. Caleb read it over her shoulder. She felt him go rigid beside her, not the old defensive tightness she'd spent weeks working out of his leg, but something else entirely. Something that had been waiting 2 years for exactly this piece of paper to exist in his hands. He wrote it down, Caleb said. Quiet. Almost to himself. Because he needed whoever did this to be clear on the details. Didn't trust anyone to remember it right, if he only said it out loud. He never thought this room would be opened by anyone but him, Odile said. Copy everything, Caleb said. I want the originals to stay right where they are until we're ready to use them properly. But copy every word. She worked for the better part of an hour, fast but careful, her hand cramping around the pencil, and Caleb held the lamp, and said almost nothing, except once, partway through, when his voice came out rougher than she'd heard it. The breeding contracts, he said. Are they in there? She looked. They were. Both of them, signed, dated, with notations in Roland's hand indicating the other parties had been told Caleb had lost interest in the arrangements. Both parties redirected to a different outfit entirely. One, whose name she'd seen once before, buried in a receipt she hadn't understood the significance of, until right now. Silverline Rail and Development. She stopped copying for a second. Just stared at the name. Caleb, she said. This name. Have you heard it before? He leaned closer, read it, shook his head slowly. No, he said. Should I have? I don't know yet, she said. But I've seen it somewhere before. And I don't think it was on this ranch. It wasn't until 3 days later, going back through her own notebook by lamplight, comparing dates and names the way she'd been trained to compare figures in a household ledger, patient, methodical, letting the pattern surface instead of forcing it, that she found where she'd seen Silverline before. Not in this notebook. In the other one. The one she'd kept for herself in the terrible months after Elias died, the one full of half-finished thoughts and unanswered questions about a mind collapse that never should have happened. She hadn't opened it in months. Hadn't wanted to. But something in Roland's letter had scratched at a memory she couldn't quite place, and she went digging for it the way you dig for a splinter you know is there even if you can't see it. She found the page near the back. Her own handwriting, shakier than it was now, written in the raw days right after the funeral, when she'd still believed writing things down might somehow undo them. Structural report says supports were substandard. Company that supplied timber and shoring for the mine, Silverline Rail and Development. Contracted through the Territory Office. No fault found, they said. No fault found. She sat very still at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low, both notebooks open in front of her side by side. Silverline. The same name. The company that had sold her husband's mine the shoring, that failed and killed him. The same company Roland Hollis had redirected 2 breeding contracts toward. The same company, whose name sat quietly in a folder in a locked storage room 4 miles outside town. She read both entries again. And again. Waiting for the coincidence to explain itself, to shrink back down, into something ordinary and unconnected. It didn't shrink. Because coincidences didn't usually come wearing the exact same name twice, in two different tragedies, 3 months and 11 miles apart. Which meant, no. Slow down. Slow down. Which meant nothing yet. Which meant a name on a page. Companies like that operated all over the territory, sold materials to a dozen outfits, 100 outfits. There was no reason yet to believe. Except there was a reason. Because Roland's letter hadn't been about buying feed or building fence. It had been about a man's leg. About making sure a man couldn't run his own land. And now this same company's name sat connected to both. Her husband. And her husband's replacement. Both broken, in different ways, by paperwork that traced back to the same 3 words. She put both notebooks down, and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes, and sat there a long moment in the low lamplight, feeling something come apart, and reassemble itself inside her chest, into a shape she didn't have a name for yet. Not grief, exactly. Grief she knew. This was something with teeth in it. Because if Silverline had a hand in Elias's death the way it had a hand in Caleb's accident, then this had never been just Caleb's fight to inherit. It had always, somehow, without her knowing it, been hers too. She told Caleb the next evening, during their session, because by now telling him things during the session had become its own kind of ritual, her hands working, his guard down enough to hear hard things, without bracing against them the way he braced against everything else. There's something else, she said. About Silverline. He went still under her hands. What? It's the same company that supplied the shoring for the mine, where my husband died, she said. The structural report cleared them. No fault found. Same words, near enough, as what's written in your file about the breeding contracts. He was quiet a long time. Long enough that she looked up from his leg to check his face. He wasn't looking at her like a man surprised. He was looking at her like a man doing the same arithmetic she'd done the night before, watching the numbers land somewhere he didn't want them to land. 2 accidents, he said slowly. 3 months apart. Same company's name attached to both. That's not a coincidence, she said. I don't believe it's a coincidence. I don't either, he said. The fire in the stove popped once, loud in the quiet kitchen. Odile, he said, using her name in that careful way he'd started using it, like it cost him something, and he wanted to spend it right. This isn't just my fight anymore, is it? It never was just yours, she said. I think I just didn't know that until last night. He reached down, not for her hand exactly, more just resting his own hand near hers on his knee, close enough that she could feel the warmth of it, without either of them making the moment bigger than it needed to be. Then we finish this together, he said. All the way through. All the way through, she agreed. Roland came back on a Monday, and this time there was no pretense left in the way he tied his horse. He didn't come in, without knocking, which somehow felt worse than the times he had. Like he was saving the trespass for something bigger. He knocked. Waited. And when Caleb opened the door, Roland's face wore an expression Odile hadn't seen on him before. The pleasantness was still there, but underneath it, working harder than usual, something else had come loose. Someone broke into the Kessler storage room, Roland said. Over the weekend. Is that right? Caleb said. If you or your wife have taken anything from that property, Roland said, I need you both to understand how serious. You need me to understand something, Caleb said, and his voice didn't rise. It went quieter instead, which was worse, which was the particular quiet of a man who has finally run out of patience for pretending. After 2 years. You need me to understand something. Roland's jaw tightened. I'm trying to protect this family, he said. You've been protecting this family straight into the ground for 2 years, Caleb said. From breeding contracts. From supply arrangements. From my own ranch. Whatever you think you found, Roland said, dropping the warmth entirely now, his voice going flat and hard underneath, you don't have the standing to do anything with it. You're a man, with a bad leg, and a wife nobody knew a month ago. This ranch exists Because I've been managing its relationships for 3 years. The moment I stop, everything falls. Maybe, Caleb said. But you're going to stop anyway. Roland's eyes moved past him, down the hall, and found Odile standing there. Something raw and unguarded surfaced in his expression for just a moment, not warmth, not calculated concern, just the understanding of a man realizing the piece of the board he'd dismissed, as harmless was the piece, that was going to bring the whole game down. You have no idea, he said to her, what you've started. I think I do, she said. He left without another word. The horse's hooves faded down the road, and Caleb closed the door slow, leaned his back against it a moment like the conversation had cost him more than it showed. He'll move fast now, Odile said. I know, Caleb said. We're not ready. Not all the way. We're not, he agreed. But we're not going to get more ready waiting on him to make the first move. 2 nights later, something woke her before dawn. Not a sound exactly. An absence of sound, the particular wrongness of a ranch, that should have been full of small night noises and wasn't. She went to the window. Saw nothing at first. Then, past the barn, a shape moving low and fast along the fence line of the near pasture, gone before she could fix it clearly in her vision. By the time Caleb reached the barn, cane forgotten somewhere behind him, 3 of the breeding marries stood loose in the yard, gates open, one favoring a leg badly enough that even in the dark Odile could see something was deeply wrong. Amos was already there, lantern raised, his face carved into something grim she hadn't seen on him before. Fence cut, he said. Deliberate. Not broke, not old, cut, same as I'd guess. That strap was cut, if you follow me. Caleb didn't answer right away. He crossed to the injured mare, ran his hands slow down her foreleg, and Odile watched 2 years of careful, patient rebuilding sit inside a man's shoulders like a physical weight. She's not broke, Caleb said finally. Strain bad. She'll mend. This time, Odile said quietly. Caleb looked up at her across the dark yard, lantern light catching the hard set of his jaw. This time, he agreed. He's done guessing whether we know. Now he's making sure we're afraid to use what we've got. Are you afraid? She asked. He was quiet a long moment, hands still resting on the mare's trembling shoulder. I was afraid for 2 years, he said. Afraid of a leg that wouldn't heal, and a life that wouldn't come back, and a cousin I couldn't prove anything against. He straightened, slow, weight settling onto both legs at once, more evenly than she'd seen him stand in weeks. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just done waiting. Then we don't wait, Odile said. Amos looked between them, lantern light shifting across 3 faces that had all, in their own way, run out of patience for being patient. Then what do we do? He asked. Odile looked at the cut fence. At the trembling mare. At the dark shape of the barn that had, 2 years ago, hidden the beginning of all of this, and she felt something settle inside her chest, cold and clear, and finally certain. We finish what we started, she said. Before he finds a way to bury it first. The mare's leg didn't break. That was the only mercy in the whole ugly night, and Odile held onto it the way you hold onto anything small, when the large things have all gone wrong at once. Because a broken leg would have meant a bullet. And a bullet would have meant Roland won something, even in the middle of losing everything else. She wasn't going to give him that. Not tonight. Not ever, if she had any say in it. Which she did. Which was the whole point now. Amos wrapped the mare's leg by lantern light, while Jessie walked the fence line twice, checking for more cuts, finding none, which somehow felt worse than finding more. Because it meant this wasn't carelessness. It meant precision. 1 clean cut in 1 strategic place, enough to spook 3 marries loose, and injure the most valuable one, enough to send a message, without quite crossing, into something a sheriff would have to act on right away. Roland was careful that way. Careful the way a man is careful, when he's done this kind of thing, before and knows exactly where the line sits. Odile stood in the cold yard, with her arms wrapped around herself, and watched Caleb work beside Amos, steady hands, steady voice, no panic in him despite everything. And she thought, not for the first time, that she had married a man built out of exactly the wrong material to be broken by fear. Which should have been comforting. Except it also meant he was the kind of man who'd walk straight into danger without blinking, and she'd learned enough about herself these past weeks to know that scared her more than any cut fence ever could. They didn't sleep. Didn't try to. By 4 a.m. they sat at the kitchen table, with every document laid out between them. The copies from the Kessler storage room. Amos's account written out in Odile's careful hand, and signed at the bottom in his own shaky one. The girth's strap itself wrapped in cloth like evidence, because that's exactly what it was. And underneath everything the land deed, with its underlined clause about bloodline, and 30 years. We go to Copper Bend, Caleb said. Territorial Land Commissioner's Office. Independent of the county sheriff. Roland's got no hold there. How do you know that? Odile asked. Because I checked, he said. Weeks ago. Same time you were checking things you didn't tell me about. She almost smiled at that. Almost. There wasn't much room left for smiling at 4 a.m, with a cut girth strap sitting on the table between 2 coffee cups. We were supposed to wait, she said. Build it slower. Make sure nothing falls apart in the telling. We don't have slower anymore, Caleb said. He cut a fence last night. Next time it's not a fence. She looked at him a long moment. At the steadiness that hadn't cracked once since the wedding, not through the accounts, not through the tack room, not through a locked storage room 4 miles outside town. And she understood, watching him now, that the steadiness had never been the absence of fear. It had been the choice to move anyway. All right, she said. Today, then? The ride to Copper Bend took 2 hours on a road that felt longer than it had any right to be. Caleb drove. Odile held the leather case, with the copied documents pressed flat against her chest like it might try to escape, if she loosened her grip even slightly. Amos rode alongside in the wagon bed, with the particular solidity of a man who'd waited 2 years to be useful in exactly this way, and wasn't about to waste the chance now that it had finally come. Because that's what 2 years of silence does to a person. It doesn't erase the thing you're carrying. It just makes you patient about setting it down. Jesse stayed behind to watch the ranch, young face set in an expression too serious for his years, standing at the gate, as they pulled out like a soldier guarding something that mattered more than he'd realized, until last night. Nobody spoke much on the road. There wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in the kitchen at 4 a.m, and besides, saying things out loud in a moving wagon felt like tempting something to go wrong just to hear itself contradicted. So they rode in silence instead. And Odile watched the scrub land roll past the way it had rolled past on her wedding day, except everything about the watching felt different now. That day she'd been counting down toward an ending. Today she was riding toward one, except this ending had teeth in it, and she didn't know yet whether those teeth would close around Roland, or around everything she'd built these past weeks. Because that was the truth nobody said out loud in the wagon. If this went wrong. If Roland found a way to twist it. Everything, the ranch, the deed, whatever this thing was growing quiet and unnamed between her and Caleb, all of it could come apart just as easily as it had come together. She pushed the thought down. Not now. Focus on the road. Focus on the case in your hands. Everything else waits until Copper Bend. The land commissioner's office sat 2 streets off the main road in a low stone building that looked like it had been built to outlast every argument that ever walked through its doors. A clerk at the front desk tried, twice, to explain that Commissioner Voss was occupied and could not be interrupted for unscheduled business. Caleb didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Tell him it's about the Hollis land grant, he said. Tell him it's about a girth strap cut clean on one side. Tell him whatever gets me through that door in the next 5 minutes, because I've waited 2 years already, and I'm done waiting politely. The clerk went pale and disappeared, and came back inside of 2 minutes, with a different expression entirely. Commissioner Adair Voss turned out to be a heavy-set man somewhere past 50, the particular kind of tired that comes from decades of listening to people who think their problem is the only urgent one in the territory. He had the look of a man who'd learned to sort real trouble from imagined trouble within about 30 seconds of a conversation starting. It took him roughly that long, sitting across his desk from the three of them, before his expression changed. "Start from the beginning," he said. "And don't leave anything out, because you think it sounds small. Small things are usually where the truth is hiding." So Odile started from the beginning. She walked him through it the way she'd walked through every account book on that kitchen table these past weeks. Plainly, in order. Each piece laid down only after the piece, before it had been fully understood. The land grant clause. The mismatched ledgers. The tack room and the strap. Amos's account of 2 riders, and money changing hands the week before Caleb's accident, and a horse, with a lightning-shaped blaze he'd know anywhere. The Kessler storage room. The letter about the structural concern we discussed. Voss read the letter twice. Set it down slow. Was quiet a moment in a way that told her he understood exactly what he was holding. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "A storage building Roland Hollis leases outside Amber Creek," Caleb said. "We believe he's the one who wrote it." "Believe, or no," Voss said. "The handwriting matches other documents he's signed," Odile said, and set 2 of Roland's business letters beside the note. "You can see it yourself." Voss looked. His jaw moved once tight. Then Amos testified, plainly, the way he told it to Odile in the tack room: 2 riders, a lightning blaze horse, money changing hands the week before the accident, and 2 years of silence he'd finally decided he couldn't carry alone anymore. When Amos finished, the office was very quiet. "There's one more thing," Odile said. Voss looked up. "There's always one more thing, isn't there?" "The company named in that letter," Odile said. "Silverline Rail and Development. It's the same company that supplied the shoring for a mine collapse in the territory 3 months ago. My first husband died in that collapse." The room went stiller than it had been, through anything else she'd said. Voss set down his pen. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that the same company connects a mine collapse and a rancher's crippling accident?" "I'm telling you I found the same name in 2 different tragedies," Odile said. "I'm not telling you what that means yet. I'm telling you it's not nothing." Voss looked at her a long moment, the particular look of a man recalibrating how large a problem he'd actually just walked into. "No," he said finally. "It's not nothing." He assigned 2 deputies to ride out to Amber Creek that same afternoon, with instructions to observe Roland Hollis's movements, without making contact, and he issued a formal hold on any property transfers or financial arrangements connected to the Hollis land grant, effective immediately. "1 week," he said. "I need time to pull records on Silverline. Time to confirm what you're telling me against what's on file with the territorial office." He looked at each of them in turn. "In the meantime, you go home. You keep your heads down. And you do not go anywhere near that storage room again, because if Roland Hollis finds out you've already been inside it, he'll have a week to build a story around whatever's missing." "We understand," Caleb said. "One more thing," Voss said, as they stood to leave. "This girth strap." He nodded at the cloth-wrapped bundle on his desk. "I want to send it to a saddler in the capital who's testified in matters like this before. If the cut's as deliberate as you say, he'll be able to confirm it wasn't where." Odile felt something loosen in her chest for the first time since the tack room. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," Voss said. "Thank me after the hearing. Right now all I've got is a strong suspicion, and a company name, that scares me more than I'd like to admit." The ride home was quieter than the ride out, in the particular way silence gets quieter after you've finally said the hardest things out loud. Not empty silence. Full silence. The kind that comes after a weight's been set down, even temporarily, even with more weight still waiting on the other side of a week. "He'll know something's moving," Caleb said, "somewhere in the second hour. Voss sending deputies out. Roland's not a fool. He'll feel it before we're back at the gate." "He will," Odile agreed. "What do we do until the hearing?" We wait, she said. Carefully. We don't give him a reason to move first. I've done a lot of waiting in 2 years, Caleb said. Never once felt like this kind. Like waiting for something instead of waiting against something. She looked at him. The late afternoon light came down flat and gold across the scrub land, catching the side of his face, and for one unguarded moment she saw exactly what 2 years of injustice looked like, when it finally had a shape to push against instead of just an absence to mourn. We're close, she said. I can feel it. Close enough to be dangerous, he said. That's usually when a man like Roland does something desperate. She didn't argue. She'd thought the exact same thing 3 times already on the ride home, and hadn't wanted to say it out loud, because saying it out loud made it more real, and some part of her, some old, tired, widow's part of her, had learned a long time ago that naming a fear sometimes felt like inviting it in. She named it anyway. Then we watch our backs, she said. Both of us. All the way through. All the way through, he echoed. Roland came to the ranch 2 days later, and this time there was no coat pressed just right, no careful assembly of pleasantness worn like armor. He came fast, on a lathered horse, and Odile watched from the kitchen window, as he swung down, before the animal had even fully stopped, and something about the wrongness of that, a man, who never hurrying, made her blood go cold, before he'd said a single word. Caleb met him in the yard. Odile followed 2 steps behind, close enough to hear, far enough to watch both their faces at once. You went to Voss, Roland said. No greeting. No pretense left at all. We did, Caleb said. Roland's face had come apart in a way she'd never seen from him. The composure was still there, technically, the way a cracked dish is still technically a dish. But underneath it, something raw and cornered was working its way to the surface. You have no idea what you're doing, Roland said. No idea the people involved in this. This isn't some local squabble, over fence lines, Caleb. This is bigger than you. Bigger than this ranch. Then tell us, Odile said. Tell us how big. Roland's eyes cut to her, and for just a moment, a single unguarded moment, she saw something underneath the anger that looked almost like fear. You don't understand, he said. Silverline doesn't lose contracts. Silverline doesn't get investigated. Silverline makes problems disappear, and right now the 2 of you are the problem. Is that a threat, Caleb asked? His voice had gone very quiet. The particular quiet Odile had learned these past weeks meant he'd stop being careful with his face. It's a warning, Roland said. From someone who still, believe it or not, doesn't want to see either one of you hurt. You cut a strap under my father's saddle, Caleb said. You had my breeding Mara's fence cut 2 nights ago. He took 1 step closer, weight settling evenly across both legs in a way Odile hadn't seen him manage in weeks. Don't stand in my yard, and tell me you don't want to see me hurt. Roland's jaw worked. For a moment nobody spoke, the whole yard gone still except for the lathered horse still blowing hard behind him. Then Roland straightened his coat, the same reflexive gesture Odile had watched him make a dozen times now, dignity as a habit too deep to break even, when everything underneath it was collapsing, and swung back up onto his horse. You'll see, he said, looking down at them both. Before this is over, you'll wish you'd left things alone. He rode out fast, the same way he'd ridden in, and Odile stood in the yard beside Caleb, and watched the dust settle behind him, and felt the cold certainty of something she couldn't quite name yet. He's scared, she said finally. That's what that was. Not anger. Fear wearing anger's clothes. Scared men are the dangerous kind, Caleb said. Scared men do things careful men wouldn't. Then we don't wait for the hearing anymore, Odile said. We go back to Voss tonight. Tell him what just happened. Caleb was already moving toward the barn. Voss listened to the account of Roland's visit, with his jaw set tight, and moved the hearing up. 3 days, he said. That's the fastest I can manage, without it looking rushed enough to get thrown out on a technicality. 3 days. Can you hold that long? We'll hold, Caleb said. Because they had to. Because 3 days felt like nothing, and everything at once, the particular kind of waiting that stretches time thin in one direction and compresses it tight in the other, until you can't tell anymore whether the hours are crawling or sprinting past you. They doubled watches on the ranch. Amos and Jesse took turns through the night, lanterns low, rifles within reach, and Odile lay awake in her room those 3 nights listening for the particular wrong silence that had woken her the night of the fence cutting, and heard, instead, only the ordinary sounds of a ranch settling into darkness. Wind. Horses shifting. The old house creaking the way old houses do. Nothing happened. Which should have felt like relief. It didn't. It felt like waiting for a held breath to finally let go, except the breath never let go, it just kept building, tighter and tighter, until the morning of the hearing arrived, and Odile woke, before dawn with her whole body strung, as tight as wire. Today, she thought. Today it ends. One way or another. The hearing was held in the county records room in Copper Bend, a long space, with high windows, and a table at the front, where Commissioner Voss sat flanked by 2 clerks. Roland sat at the opposite table, with an attorney of his own, a well-dressed man, who kept his face arranged into an expression of patient skepticism, the look of a man being paid to doubt everything, until proven otherwise. The room filled slowly. Amber Creek residents, some drawn by genuine concern, others by the particular hunger small towns have for watching one of their own come apart in public. Odile scanned the crowd once, and found faces she recognized. Prudence Kell near the back, hands folded, watching with an expression Odile couldn't quite read. The feed merchant. The dry goods woman, who remembered everything, and forgot nothing. Because that was the truth about small towns, wasn't it? They forgave slowly, and they forgot even slower, and today every person in this room was going to watch the story get rewritten, whether they liked the new version or not. Commissioner Voss called the hearing to order. "We're here," he said, "to consider evidence of fraud, misappropriation of ranch assets, and pending further findings, deliberate bodily harm, brought against Roland Hollis by his cousin, Caleb Hollis, and Caleb's wife, Odile Hollis." He looked out over the room. "This is not a trial. This is a formal review to determine whether sufficient evidence exists to refer these matters to a territorial court. I expect this room to conduct itself accordingly." Odile stood first, because that had been decided the night before, in the kitchen, over cold coffee either of them finished. She would walk them through the documents. Caleb would speak to what he'd lived through. Amos would speak to what he'd seen. She laid it out the way she'd laid it out for Voss the week before. Plainly. In order. Each piece confirming the last. The land grant clause. The mismatched ledgers, spread now across the long table for anyone to examine. The letter about the structural concern we discussed, placed last, deliberately, because she'd learned enough about storytelling these past weeks to know you didn't waste your strongest piece early. Roland's attorney rose twice to object. Chain of evidence. The legality of entering the Kessler property. Voss overruled both times, his patience visibly thinning with each interruption. Then Amos testified. Plain. Unpolished. 2 years of silence finally given somewhere to go, and when he finished, the room had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of people realizing a story they thought they knew had a much darker version running underneath it the whole time. Roland's attorney stood for his cross-examination, and here, finally, the counter-narrative Odile had expected all along began to take shape. "Mr. Amos," he said, "you've worked for the Hollis family how long?" "Near 15 years. And in 15 years, you never once reported these suspicions to any authority. Not the sheriff. Not a single soul outside this family. Correct?" "Correct," Amos said. "Isn't it convenient," the attorney said, "that these memories surface now, at the exact moment a new wife arrives, and begins asking questions about the family's finances? Isn't it possible, Mr. Amos, that a persuasive young woman found it useful to have an old man's loyalty redirected toward a story that benefits her?" The room stirred. Odile felt her own pulse jump hard once, and made herself sit perfectly still, because reacting was exactly what the question was designed to provoke. Amos didn't flinch. "Ma'am didn't put words in my mouth," he said. "She asked me nothing. I told her what I saw, because I'd carried it 2 years, and finally had someone worth telling." He looked past the attorney, straight at Roland. "Wasn't her that cut, that mare loose 2 nights back neither." The attorney tried to redirect, and Voss cut him off. "Let the witness finish," Voss said. "I'm finished," Amos said. "Said what I saw? Same thing I'd say to God himself, if he asked." Then it was Caleb's turn, and Odile watched him rise from his chair, cane in hand, the way it had been every day since she'd known him, and walk slowly to the front of the room, and something in her chest tightened watching the effort it cost him, the careful management of weight and balance that had become as familiar to her hands as her own. He spoke plainly, the way he did everything. Told the room about the accident 2 years back. A fall that had never made sense to him. A horse he'd ridden 100 times. A fence post he'd checked himself the week before. Told them about the 2 years since. The contracts lost. The ledgers he couldn't make add up no matter how many nights he sat with them. The quiet, grinding certainty that something had been taken from him that he couldn't name or prove. "Until now," he said. "Until my wife came into this house and started asking the questions I'd stopped letting myself ask." Roland's attorney stood again. "Mr. Hollis," he said, "isn't it true that you've suffered significant hardship these past 2 years? Financial strain? Physical limitation? Isn't it possible that hardship has made you, understandably, eager to find someone to blame? Anyone at all?" "I'd love someone to blame, that isn't blood," Caleb said. "I'd have loved it 2 years ago, when the doctor told me the nerve wasn't coming back. I didn't have proof then. I have it now. Proof," the attorney said, "that your own wife assembled, in a house she'd lived in for barely 2 months. Caleb's jaw tightened. Odile watched him hold something back, watched the effort it took, and admired him for it more than she could have said out loud in that moment. "She's the first person in 2 years who looked at those books and told me the truth instead of a comfortable version of it," he said. "If that makes her dangerous to somebody, maybe that somebody ought to ask himself why the truth scares him so much." A murmur ran through the room. Voss rapped once, mild, more habit than real correction. Roland's attorney called his own witnesses next. Men from town, who spoke to Roland's years of generosity, his standing, the countless small kindnesses he'd shown the community. It was, Odile had to admit, a well-built story. Believable. The kind of story small towns wanted to believe, because the alternative meant admitting the man they trusted for years had been rotten underneath the whole time, and nobody liked discovering that about someone they'd broken bread with. She watched the room's mood shift, subtly, towards sympathy. Watched a few faces that had looked stricken during Amos's testimony start to look merely uncertain instead. Because that's how it worked, wasn't it? Truth wasn't loud enough on its own. Truth needed something undeniable sitting behind it, or a good enough story could still smother it, before it ever got the chance to breathe. She thought of the letter. Regarding the structural concern we discussed. It was sitting on the table already, entered as evidence, but entering it wasn't the same as making the room feel its weight. She stood again, without being asked, and Voss glanced at her, surprised, then nodded permission. "I'd like to read something into the record," she said. "In Mr. Hollis's own handwriting." She read the letter aloud, slow, every word landing separate and hard in the quiet room. Regarding the structural concern we discussed. Handle it the way we spoke about. No further correspondence needed on this matter. Silence. This was found, she said, in a locked storage room Mr. Hollis leases outside town. Written 1 week before Mr. Caleb Hollis's accident. The company mentioned in the records connected to that same room, Silverline Rail and Development, is the same company that supplied the shoring materials for a mine collapse 3 months ago in this territory. A collapse that killed my first husband. The room had gone utterly still. "I am not asking this hearing to believe me, because my story is sympathetic," she said. I'm asking you to believe the paper. Because paper doesn't grieve, and paper doesn't have a reason to lie for me. It's just there, saying what it says. Roland's attorney rose to object, and this time his voice had lost some of its earlier polish. Coincidence, he started. Two unrelated incidents, connected only by. The doors at the back of the room opened. Everyone turned. Odile turned with them, and for one disoriented moment she didn't understand what she was looking at. A man in a dark traveling coat, dust still on his boots, from the road, flanked by two deputies she didn't recognize, walking down the center aisle, with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who'd been sent for. Commissioner Voss stood. "Mr. Cobb," he said. "You made good time." The man, Wendell Cobb, Odile would learn in the next 30 seconds, though the name meant nothing to her yet, stopped at the front of the room, and turned to face the gallery. "I represent Silverline Rail and Development," he said. "Regional Operations. I was contacted several days ago by Commissioner Voss's office regarding an inquiry into 2 incidents in this territory." He glanced once, briefly, at Roland, whose face had gone the color of old ash. "I've come to give a statement. Under my own volition. Because I have spent 18 months watching my employer bury problems the way this man is trying to bury this one, and I am done being party to it." The room erupted into low murmurs. Voss rapped hard this time, and the noise settled reluctantly. "Continue, Mr. Cobb," Voss said. Cobb reached into his coat, and produced a folder of his own, thin, official, nothing like the improvised evidence Odile had assembled over weeks of careful, patient work. This was clean. Typed. The kind of documentation that came from inside an organization, not from someone trying to prove a case against it, from the outside. "Silverline has a standing arrangement with Roland Hollis," Cobb said, dating back approximately 3 years. "In exchange for below-market supply contracts and preferential terms on future land acquisitions, Mr. Hollis provided Silverline with regular reports on ranch operations, resource assessments, and," his voice caught, just slightly, the first crack Odile had heard in an otherwise steady delivery, "information regarding obstacles to acquiring additional acreage in the region." "Obstacles," Voss repeated. "Meaning what, precisely?" "Meaning landowners unwilling to sell," Cobb said. "The Hollis Ranch sits on a stretch of land Silverline has wanted for 18 months, for a rail spur connecting to a proposed mining operation 11 miles east. Mr. Caleb Hollis had repeatedly declined offers to sell or lease. His accident 2 years ago occurred 4 days after the third and final offer was refused." The room had gone, so quiet Odile could hear her own pulse in her ears. "There's one more matter," Voss said. "Deputies located a horse this morning stabled at a line camp Silverline leases 6 miles north of here. A bay gelding, blaze marked like lightning across the face, off-center." He looked at Amos. "Does that sound familiar to you?" Amos's face didn't move for a moment. Then it did. "That's the horse," he said. "That's the same horse I saw at the grain shed 2 years back. I'd swear to it before God." Odile felt something settle into place inside her chest, quiet and final, the last piece of a shape she'd been tracing for weeks finally closing. "And the mind collapse?" she made herself ask, her voice steadier than she felt. 3 months ago. The one that killed my husband." Cobb turned to look at her directly for the first time, and something in his face, regret, maybe, or the particular exhaustion of a man finally setting down a weight he'd carried too long, softened just slightly. "Silverline supplied substandard shoring materials to that operation," he said. "Knowingly. To cut costs on a contract already running over budget. The structural report that cleared the company of fault was," his jaw tightened, "amended, after the fact, by someone inside the Territorial Inspector's office, who received payment for the amendment. I have documentation of that payment as well." Odile sat very still. She had spent 3 months believing her husband's death was an accident born of bad luck and worse timber. She had spent 3 months grieving a randomness that, it turned out, had never been random at all. Because it wasn't luck. It was never luck. It was a company cutting corners on a contract, and a man somewhere signing a report he knew was false, and Elias 3 weeks dying in a bed, while everyone around her called it an accident, because accident was a word that let people stop asking questions. She felt something crack open in her chest, not grief exactly, grief she'd already lived through and come out the other side of. Something colder. Something that had teeth. "Mr. Cobb," Voss said, "why come forward now? What changed?" Cobb was quiet a moment. "I have a daughter," he said finally. 11 years old. I've spent 18 months telling myself the reports I filed were somebody else's decisions, somebody else's blame to carry." He looked at Odile, then at Caleb, then back at the commissioner. "When your office contacted Silverline's regional office, I was the one who took the call. I could have handed it to someone else. I chose not to. Because I'm tired of teaching my daughter, without meaning to, that a man keeps quiet, as long as the money's good enough." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Even Roland's attorney had gone still, his earlier polish nowhere in evidence now. Roland stood. He hadn't been asked to. Voss looked at him, surprised, and something passed across the commissioner's face that suggested he was curious enough to allow it, at least for a moment. "This is absurd," Roland said, but his voice had lost the certainty it carried an hour ago. "This man is protecting his own company by throwing me to the wolves. I've done nothing that wasn't already standard practice." "Standard practice," Caleb said. He hadn't stood, hadn't moved, but his voice cut clean through Roland's sentence like a blade through soft wood. "Is cutting a girth strap standard practice, Roland? Is cutting a fence line 2 nights before a hearing standard practice?" "I never touched that fence," Roland said, too fast, too sharp, and Odile watched his composure finally, fully give way. "I never." He stopped himself. Too late. The room had already heard it. The specificity of the denial, answering an accusation nobody had made out loud in that room yet, because the fence cutting had never once been mentioned in testimony. Voss's eyes narrowed. "Nobody in this hearing has said anything about a fence, Mr. Hollis," he said quietly. "How did you know we were talking about a fence?" Roland opened his mouth. Closed it. The silence stretched long enough to become its own kind of confession, the particular silence of a man watching, in real time, the exact moment his own mouth had undone 2 years of careful architecture. "I want to add something to the record," Caleb said, and this time he did stand. It cost him. Odile watched it cost him, watched the careful shift of weight, the brief tightening at his jaw, as he came up off the chair, but he came up, without reaching for the cane, where it leaned against the table, and he stood there a moment, both legs beneath him, before he took his first step forward. The room noticed. She heard it, before she understood it, a shift in the quality of the silence, dozens of people all realizing at once what they were watching. A man who'd walked into this room leaning on a cane, walking now, slow, deliberate, unaided, the length of the aisle toward the front table, where Roland stood frozen. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. She could see, even from where she sat, the concentration it demanded, the careful negotiation between what his body used to do, and what it had relearned how to do these past weeks on a kitchen floor, with her hands working the damaged tissue back towards something like trust. But he walked. Both feet. All the way to the front. He stopped across the table, from his cousin, close enough that Roland had nowhere left to look except directly at him. "I want to state for the record," Caleb said, addressing Voss but never taking his eyes off Roland, "that I have suspected for 2 years my accident was no accident. I have suspected it every single day I couldn't walk without help. Every single day I watched contracts I'd built disappear without explanation. Every single day my cousin sat at my table and told me he was protecting me." He paused. The room held its breath along with him. "The evidence in front of this hearing confirms that suspicion beyond any doubt I have left," he said. "I am asking this commission to take formal action against Roland Hollis for fraud, for the deliberate injury inflicted on me 2 years ago, and for whatever role he played in the events that led to the death of Odile Hollis's first husband. He looked at Voss. I've waited 2 years to say this in a room that could actually do something about it. I'm done waiting any longer. Voss looked at Roland. Mr. Hollis, he said, do you have anything further to add before this commission renders its determination? Roland's attorney leaned toward him, whispered something urgent. Roland didn't seem to hear it. He was looking at Caleb, and something in his face had gone entirely empty, the particular emptiness of a man watching the whole architecture of his life come down around him, and discovering, in the moment of collapse, that he never actually built a version of himself that could survive without it. I did what I had to do, he said, so quiet it barely carried past the front row. This ranch was never going to hold up on cattle and stubbornness forever. I saw an opportunity to secure something bigger for this family, and I... He stopped. There was nothing left of the sentence worth finishing. The deputies moved forward. It wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No struggle. Roland stood and straightened his coat, with the same reflexive dignity Odile had watched him perform a dozen times before, the habit outliving every reason he'd ever had to wear it, and he walked out flanked by 2 deputies, with his chin level, and his face showing nothing at all. At the door he paused. Looked back once. He looked at Odile first. His expression said several things at once, none of which she let herself absorb fully. Then he looked at Caleb, and something passed between the 2 cousins. 2 years of shared history, all of it wrecked now, none of it recoverable, and neither of them said a single word. Then the deputies moved, and Roland was gone, and the room exhaled all at once, the sound of 40 people remembering how to breathe normally at the same time. Voss let the room settle, before he spoke again. This commission finds sufficient cause, he said, to refer all matters against Roland Hollis to territorial court, on charges of fraud, misappropriation of ranch assets, and conspiracy to commit bodily harm. Formal charges will be filed within the week. The land grant hold on the Hollis property is lifted, effective immediately, and reverts fully to Caleb and Odile Hollis. He looked between them. This hearing is closed. That was all. A gavel that wasn't a gavel, just a heavy-set man saying words, that ended one part of the fight, and left the rest of it to paperwork and patience. Odile sat very still at the table, and did not let herself feel anything fully yet. There was still process ahead. Still a courtroom she hadn't stood in. But underneath everything else, a piece of information sat in her chest, that she hadn't had time to hold, yet that Elias's death, the collapse that had taken 6 weeks of her life, and left her counting $11 into a handkerchief every night, had never been the accident she'd spent 3 months grieving as random. It had been a company's decision. A cost saved. A report amended for a price. She felt Caleb's hand find hers under the table, warm, steady, and she let herself hold onto it without looking at him, because looking at him right now would have undone something she needed to keep together a little longer. You should sit, she said quietly. I know, he said. He didn't move. Not yet. Cobb approached them, after the room had mostly cleared, hat in hand, the particular careful posture of a man who knew an apology wouldn't be enough, and offered one anyway. I'm sorry, he said to Odile. For your husband. I should have said something 18 months ago. You're saying it now, she said, echoing, without quite meaning to, the same words she'd given Amos in the tack room. That matters more than you think it does. Cobb nodded, throat working once, and left without saying anything else. She watched him go, and thought that maybe that was the truest thing this whole terrible ordeal had produced. Not just justice for Caleb. Not just the truth about Elias. But a stranger's daughter somewhere who'd grow up not knowing how close her father had come to staying silent, and being better for the not knowing. The weeks after moved differently than the ones before them. Not easier exactly, but forward instead of sideways, which was its own kind of relief. Formal charges were filed against Roland, within the week, exactly as Voss promised, and word of it spread through Amber Creek the way word always spread through small towns, fast, half-true, reshaping itself with every telling, until Odile stopped bothering to correct the versions she overheard at the dry goods counter. She kept the household running. She managed the supply arrangements that had collapsed the moment Silverline's involvement came under investigation, finding new suppliers through channels that turned out to be nowhere near as complicated as Roland had needed them to seem. Because that had been the whole design, hadn't it? Complexity as control. Make a thing look impossibly tangled, and the person trapped inside it stops believing they can ever untangle it themselves. Strip the architecture away, and underneath it, most things were simple. Feed. Timber. A fair price from a merchant, who turned out to be exactly as honest as Amos had always said he was. Amos gave a second, shorter statement to a territorial clerk during the third week of the process, and came back looking lighter than she'd seen him look since the day he'd first told her about 2 riders and a lightning blaze horse. Not happy, exactly. Amos wasn't built for happiness, as a resting state. But settled. The particular settledness of a man who'd finally put down a weight he'd stopped noticing how much it had bent him, until the moment it was gone. "How'd it go?" she asked him, when he came in for the noon meal. "Said what I saw," he said. "Same as I told you the first time. That's all it needed to be." He ate in silence after that. But before he went back out, he paused at the door, didn't turn around, and said it to the wall instead of to her face, the way men of his generation sometimes said the things that mattered most. "You did right, Mrs. Hollis. Coming here. Doing what you did." "Thank you, Amos," she said. He went out. She stood a long moment in the kitchen doorway watching him cross the yard, and thought that of everything this whole ordeal had cost, giving an old man back 2 years of carried silence felt, in its own quiet way, like one of the truest victories in the whole story. Jesse, for his part, had considerably more to say about all of it, and said it, over the following weeks in scattered installments, processing the entire ordeal out loud to whichever ear would tolerate him. He was 22, and it had been, by any measure, an extraordinary few months, and young men needed to talk their way through extraordinary things the way older men sometimes needed to go quiet through them. Both were legitimate ways of carrying something too big to hold silently. Odile had learned that from watching her own mother work through hard years, decades before. The letter about the breeding contracts came a few weeks later, brief and formal, indicating both parties Roland had misled were willing to discuss reinstatement now that the fraud behind the original terminations had been formally established. Caleb read it at the kitchen table. Read it twice, the same careful, deliberate way he read everything that mattered. Then set it down, and looked at it a long moment without speaking. Odile stood at the stove, and didn't press him. She'd learned these past weeks that some silences needed room to finish themselves without interruption. "The Prescott Ranch," he said eventually, naming the larger of the 2 operations. "Warren Prescott. I've known that family since I was a boy." He was quiet a beat. "Roland told him I'd lost interest in the arrangement. Told him I'd decided to change direction entirely." "You can write to him now," she said. "I know." He looked up at her. "I should have written to him 2 years ago." "You didn't have proof 2 years ago," she said. "And you were still on 2 canes. There's no shame in what 2 years of healing cost you." He was quiet a moment longer. "I know," he said again, differently this time. Not self-recrimination. Just acknowledgement, the particular sound of a man finally letting himself off a hook he'd been carrying far too long. She brought 2 cups of coffee, and sat across from him, the letter between them, the ranch quiet around them in the particular way a place goes quiet after a long fight finally starts to settle. "It's not everything," she said. "Some of the money's gone for good. The 2 years are gone for good. You don't get those back no matter what any letter says." "No," he agreed. "But the rest of it's mine again." She wrapped both hands around her cup, and looked down at the table. "The rest of it," he said, "is more than I had any right to expect, going into this." Something in the way he said it carried more weight than the sentence's plain words accounted for, and she heard it, the way you hear an undertone in a piece of music you can't quite name yet. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. She'd learned, these past months, that some things needed time, before they became speakable out loud. Because she was learning something about herself too, slower than she'd like, more uncomfortable than she'd expected. She had always believed herself patient, methodical, unhurried. But sitting with a feeling she couldn't yet name, something that had been growing quietly in the spaces between the evening sessions, and the quiet meals, and the conversations that had wandered, without either of them quite deciding to let them, into real depth, sitting with that, without acting on it, without even fully looking at it, turned out to be far harder than she'd expected. She thought about Elias, that night, lying awake, listening to the ranch settle around her. Thought about what she actually felt, when she let herself think of him now, honestly, instead of the grief she believed she was supposed to have. Sadness, yes. For what he'd tried to build. For what it had cost him in the end. But also, if she was honest, with herself the way she'd learned to be honest, with a ledger, a different kind of grief. Grief for the marriage she'd wanted, and never quite found inside the one she'd had. Elias had been warm, optimistic, and fundamentally alone at the center of himself in a way she'd never once been able to reach, no matter how hard she tried. She had loved him. She hadn't always felt known by him. She thought about what being known actually looked like, stripped down to its plainest form. It looked like someone reading your face correctly the moment you walked through a door. It looked like being told a hard truth, without being shielded from it out of some misplaced idea of kindness. It looked like someone watching you work, and understanding what the work cost you, without needing you to explain any of it out loud. It looked, she thought, like these last months. She turned off the lamp. The letter to Warren Prescott went out the following Monday. Caleb spent 2 full days drafting it, and Odile saw the paper at the kitchen table, the crossed-out lines, the false starts, and what he finally sent was a single page, plain and direct, stating the facts of what had happened, and asking, without pride standing in the way, whether Prescott might be willing to discuss reinstating the arrangement on whatever terms suited him now. Prescott's answer came inside of 2 weeks. Brief. Warm. He never understood, he wrote, why Caleb had pulled out of the deal in the first place, and had been sorry to lose it. He'd be glad to meet come spring. Caleb read it standing in the hallway, and Odile watched his face, from the kitchen doorway, without him noticing. In that unguarded moment his expression carried something quieter, and more private than anything she'd witnessed through the hearing, and its aftermath, the simple, unadorned look of a man who'd had something taken from him and had just, after a very long wait, gotten a piece of it handed back. She went back to the stove, and let him have the moment to himself. He came in a few minutes later, sat down, and told her Prescott wanted to meet in the spring. Said he had 2 marries he'd been holding back, waiting on an arrangement he could actually trust. That's good, she said. It's very good. It's the beginning of what I wanted before, he said. Before Roland. Before any of it. He looked around the kitchen, out through the window at the pasture, the particular expression of a man reconsidering a future he'd stopped letting himself imagine. Horses. Breeding stock. Working with outfits that need good animals and know the difference. My father ran cattle, because that's what a man did in his day. I always thought, he stopped. You thought what? That the land could do something better suited to it. He paused. Cattle are fine. But a horse bred right, worked right, that knows exactly what it's doing under a rider, that's a different kind of thing. There's craft in it. Something worth building a whole life around. She watched him talk about it, and understood she was seeing something she'd only glimpsed pieces of, before, in the evenings, during the sessions, in the way he'd once described the east pasture in spring lit yellow, from the inside. But not the full version. Not the version where he let himself want something forward, instead of only defending what remained behind him. Then do it, she said. He looked at her. Don't wait for it to feel safe, she said. Don't wait for a guarantee that isn't coming. You know this land better than anyone alive. You know horses. You've got a man already interested. Start. Something in his face opened, plain and unguarded. You sound very certain, he said. I am certain, she said, returning to her work at the counter. I've watched you nearly 2 months now. I know what you're good at. What am I good at? He asked, and she couldn't quite place the tone underneath the question, somewhere between curiosity and something more careful than that. She thought about it honestly before answering. You're patient in the right ways, she said. And stubborn in the right ones, too. You pay attention to things most people walk right past without noticing. And you don't quit. Even when quitting would have been the reasonable thing to do, you don't. The kitchen went quiet. That's more than most people manage, he said, quiet. Yes, she said. It is. She kept her hands busy at the counter, but she felt the particular weight of his attention, from across the room, that same steady, unhurried focus he brought to everything that mattered to him. This time she let herself feel it fully, without deflecting it away. That, in its own small way, was its own kind of courage. New enough that it still cost her something to allow. It was Jessie, characteristically, who set the last piece in motion, without any idea he was doing anything significant at all. A mild Sunday, 2 weeks after Prescott's letter arrived. The sky a clean pale gray, ground hard with early cold. Jessie had been clearing brush near the old corral behind the barn, routine maintenance, nothing more, when he came to the back door and knocked. Mrs. Hollis, he said. Found something back here. Thought you'd want to see it. She followed him around the barn to a stretch of ground between the old structure and the fence line, overgrown with dry grass, and a tangle of dead brush he'd been cutting back. Underneath it, revealed now in a rough clearing, sat the remains of an old round pen. The kind used for gentling green horses. Worn posts still standing, the rail fallen in 2 places, but the frame otherwise sound. She stood looking at it a long moment. She hadn't known it was there. But she'd heard about it once, weeks earlier, during a session, when she'd asked Caleb, the way she sometimes did, to give him something to hold instead of the pain, to name something specific and good. He'd given her the east pasture the first time. The second time, without any apparent forethought, he told her about a round pen his father had built behind the barn, where the 2 of them used to work young horses together on long summer evenings, his father calling out corrections from the rail, Caleb inside working the animal, both of them arguing good-naturedly for years about which of them had the better hand for it. She'd felt the muscle in his leg release under her hands, while he told her. Don't clear anything else back here, she told Jessie now. Leave it exactly as it is. Yes, ma'am. She spent 4 mornings working on it, before Caleb was fully awake, dragging fallen rail back into place, resetting the posts that had rotted at the base, clearing the last of the brush, with her own hands until her palms blistered and stayed sore for the better part of a week. She didn't ask Amos or Jessie to help. Some things, she'd come to understand, were better done alone, quietly, without the weight of being explained in advance. He found it on a cold Saturday afternoon in late November. She was in the kitchen when she heard the back door open, and then, after a pause that stretched longer than it should have, knock close again. She waited a moment, dried her hands, went to the doorway. He stood at the edge of the cleared ground, looking at the pen. Coat on, no cane, he'd been moving around the ranch, without it more and more these past weeks, reaching for it now mostly on uneven ground, out of caution rather than need. His hands were in his pockets. His back was to her. She said nothing. Let the moment hold itself. How long has this been here? He asked finally, without turning around. It was always here, she said. Under the brush. Jessie found it clearing back there. Another pause. You cleared it, he said. I did. He turned around. His whole face had come open in a way she hadn't seen from him yet, no management left in it at all. My father used to say, he started, and stopped. Started again. He used to say the mark of a good throw wasn't the ones that landed clean. It was the ones you attempted, when you weren't sure yet you could make them. He looked at the pen, then back at her. I haven't thought about him saying that in a long time. She stepped out of the doorway, crossed the cold ground to stand beside him, and together they looked at the cleared corral, the reset posts, the fallen rail she'd hauled back into place with her own aching hands. "Try it," she said. "It's been 2 years." "I know." He was quiet a moment. Then he walked forward, slow, into the center of the pen, and stood there alone, while doing the same silent calculation she'd watched him do 100 times these past months. The balance of his weight, what the leg could carry now, and what it still couldn't, the whole careful architecture of a body relearning trust in itself. He didn't run a horse. There was no horse to run, not yet. He just stood there in the center of the space his father had built, both feet under him, steady, and turned in a slow full circle, taking it in the way a man takes in a thing he'd once been certain was gone, from him for good. Then he looked at her, and said her name. Just her name, plainly, the way he hadn't quite let himself say it before, without the careful distance he'd always kept folded around it, like a man setting down something heavy he'd been carrying, so long he'd forgotten it had a weight. "Odile." "I know," she said. And she did know. She'd known it building slowly, without announcement, the way true things tend to arrive, when you're not watching for them. She'd known it in Copper Bend, when the hearing had gone badly, and then suddenly, impossibly, better. She'd known it the evening he talked about Prescott's marries, and let himself want a future out loud for the first time. She'd known it in her own blistered hands, working a round pen back into shape in the cold mornings, before he woke, for no reason she could have explained plainly to anyone who asked. She had not come from a life that taught her to expect things to go well. She had been shaped by loss, and by the slow grinding kind of difficulty that never makes for a tidy story, but that builds, over enough years, people who know exactly how to hold on to what actually matters once they finally find it. This was what she was still learning, imperfectly, standing in the cold beside a man who just walked into the center of his father's corral on 2 legs that both, finally, held. The difference between surviving and living. Surviving was what she'd done for 4 months, with $11 folded into a handkerchief. It was not nothing. She wanted to be clear about that, in whatever part of her was still keeping the accounts. Surviving had kept her upright, and moving through every single thing the past year had asked of her. But living was the thing you did, when you let something matter again. When you let someone matter. When you looked at the distance between where you stood and where you wanted to be, and stepped toward it anyway, not because it was certain, but because you'd finally decided safe and alive weren't the same word, and you were done confusing the two. "I didn't want this marriage," she said. "I know," he said. "Neither did I." "It wasn't what either of us would have chosen," she said. "Under any circumstance we'd have picked for ourselves." "No," he agreed. "It wasn't." She looked at him directly. "I'm not sorry it happened," she said. The words sat between them in the cold air, plain and impossible to take back. He looked at her a long moment. The same careful gray eyes that had given her nothing at all the first day they met in Whitfield's office were not careful now. They were simply present, fully present, the way he was, when something mattered enough to stop guarding against it. "Neither am I," he said. He reached out and took her hand. No ceremony to it. Just his hand closing around hers, and she let him, and they stood together in the cold behind the barn, in a corral his father had built, and she had dug back out of the earth, with her own 2 hands, and the light went from gold to gray around them. "It's going to take time," she said. "All of it. The ranch. The breeding contracts. Rebuilding what 2 years took away. I know that. And she hesitated, "we're going to have to figure out what we actually are to each other. Not just let it be whatever it's already become, without either of us naming it." "I know that too," he said. His thumb moved once against the back of her hand. "I'm not in a hurry." She looked up at him, and found, with some surprise, that it was true for her too. "I'm not either," she said. For a woman who'd spent the better part of a year living inside the particular urgency of having no options left at all, she was, in that moment, standing in a cold field, with mud on her boots, and a man's hand around hers, entirely unhurried. It was enough. More than enough. Spring came slow that year, the way it always did in that stretch of country, teasing green into the hills weeks before it committed to staying. Warren Prescott rode out in April, with 2 Maras in tow, and a handshake that lasted a beat longer than handshakes usually did, the particular gesture of a man glad to be doing business again, with someone he trusted. On a Sunday in early May, with the round pen finally holding a green colt, Caleb was working slow and patient at the end of a lead line. Odile stood at the rail and watched him move. Both feet steady under him now, the limp still there, and likely always would be, but no longer the whole of what defined how he crossed a piece of ground. He caught her watching. Didn't stop the work. Just glanced over the corner of his mouth, doing the small reluctant thing that passed, for Caleb Hollis, as close to a full smile as the world was generally going to get. She smiled back. Let herself hold on to the moment, without rushing past it, the way she was still learning to do. The ranch wasn't finished healing. Some things never would be. The 2 years Roland had stolen. The truth about Elias she'd carried differently now, but no less heavily. The long, slow work still ahead of building something whole out of everything that had been broken along the way. But it was standing. Both of them were standing. And behind the barn, in a corral built by a father who never lived to see it used again, a green colt was learning, one careful circle at a time, that trust could be rebuilt even in a place that had once taught it to disappear. That, she thought, watching Caleb work the lead line loose and let the colt find its own steady footing across the open ground, was the whole of it in the end. Not the vengeance. Not even the justice, though that had mattered plenty. Just this. 2 people, broken in different ways by the same kind of quiet, patient cruelty, standing in a field they'd fought to keep, choosing, every single ordinary day, from here forward, to build something neither one of them would have to survive alone.